Daniel had always been the brightest student in his class. From an early age, he was praised for his intelligence, his quick thinking, and his ability to grasp new concepts faster than most of his peers. Teachers admired him, his parents were proud, and his friends looked up to him. But there was one problem. Daniel never accepted failure. Whenever he made a mistake, he found an excuse. If he struggled with a problem, he would blame the situation rather than his own effort. At first, it didn't seem to matter. His natural intelligence carried him through most challenges with ease, but as the years went by and school became harder, something began to change. Daniel stopped trying. Instead of studying, he spent more and more time playing video games and watching TV. Homework was done in a rush, and lessons were barely reviewed. But in his mind, he believed he would always find a way to succeed. After all, he always had before. One day, his teacher noticed the change and gave him a warning. "Daniel, you have a gift, but if you rely too much on it without putting in the effort, you will run into trouble." Daniel simply smiled and shrugged. "I'll be fine. I only need to study the night before the test." What he didn't know was that this mindset was about to be his greatest downfall. The day of the big exam arrived, and Daniel walked into the classroom with his usual confidence. He barely glanced at his notes, convinced that a quick review would be enough. As he sat down and flipped over the test paper, however, a strange feeling crept over him. The questions looked unfamiliar. The formulas he thought he knew suddenly felt distant. His mind raced, searching for answers that refused to come. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt completely lost. He struggled through the test, scribbling down anything that came to mind. His hands were shaking by the time he finished, and as he handed in his paper, he felt a sinking feeling in his chest. But even then, a small part of him held on to hope. "Maybe I did better than I thought," he told himself. A few days later, the results were posted. Daniel eagerly scanned the list, expecting to see his name near the top, but when he found it, his breath caught in his throat. He had failed. The weight of disappointment hit him like a wave. His classmates whispered in surprise. His teacher gave him a knowing look, but said nothing. And when he got home, his parents' expressions told him everything before they even spoke. But the worst part? That night, when he reached out to his friends to study together, one of them hesitated before saying, "You couldn't even do well on your own test. How can you help us?" Those words cut deeper than any grade ever could. For the first time, Daniel felt something unfamiliar: self-doubt. Maybe he wasn't as smart as he had always believed. Maybe his confidence had been built on nothing but luck. And for the first time, he asked himself a question he had never considered before. What if I've been wrong all along? Daniel sat alone in his room that evening, staring at his failed test paper. The red marks on the page felt like a mirror reflecting his own mistakes. He wanted to blame something: bad luck, tricky questions, not feeling well that day. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had failed because he hadn't prepared. Just as frustration threatened to overwhelm him, his grandfather walked in. The old man had always been a quiet observer, never one to lecture unnecessarily. But tonight, he saw something different in his grandson's eyes. A mix of disappointment, confusion, and an unspoken plea for guidance. With a knowing smile, his grandfather sat beside him and said, "Let me tell you a story." Daniel looked up, curious. His grandfather was full of wisdom, and his stories always had a lesson hidden within them. He began, "There was once a wealthy merchant named Marcus. He was ambitious, clever, and always eager to expand his business. But there was one problem. Marcus never learned from his mistakes. Every time he made a bad investment, he blamed someone else. Every time he lost money, he told himself it was just bad luck. One day, he invested his entire fortune into a risky deal without doing his research. When it collapsed, he was left with nothing. He sat in despair, wondering why life was so unfair." Daniel listened closely, sensing that the story was leading to something important. His grandfather continued, "A wise sage happened to pass by and saw Marcus sulking. He sat down beside him and said, 'Failure is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It will return again and again until you finally choose to learn from it.'" Daniel frowned, deep in thought. Could it be that failure wasn't the end? but just the beginning of something greater? His grandfather placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "You have two choices now, Daniel. You can sit here feeling sorry for yourself, or you can learn, improve, and make sure this failure becomes the turning point of your life." For the first time that day, Daniel felt hope. Maybe he had failed this time, but that didn't mean he had to keep failing. Maybe, just maybe, he could change. That night, Daniel lay in bed, unable to sleep. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Failure is not your enemy, it is your teacher. For so long, he had feared failure, avoiding it, denying it, making excuses for it. But what if failure wasn't the problem? What if the real problem was his unwillingness to learn from it? For the first time, Daniel didn't push the thought away, he faced it. And at that moment, he made a decision he was going to change. The next morning, instead of waking up late and wasting time, he did something he had never done before. He created a study plan. He wrote down his weak subjects, set goals, and even scheduled specific times for review. At first, it was incredibly difficult. His old habits pulled at him like chains. The moment he sat down to study, his mind wandered to the video games on his shelf and the TV in the living room. One evening, he reached for the remote, ready to give himself just a 5-minute break. But as his fingers hovered over the power button, his grandfather's story flashed in his mind. The merchant who kept making the same mistakes because he refused to change. Daniel clenched his jaw, put the remote down, and turned back to his books. For the first time, he was studying not because someone told him to, but because he wanted to improve. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he felt like giving up. But with every page he read, every problem he solved, and every distraction he resisted, something inside him started to shift. He was no longer just the smart kid who relied on luck. He was becoming someone who worked for success. Weeks passed, and slowly but surely, Daniel began to notice a difference. Concepts that once confused him started to make sense. The subjects he used to ignore now felt more manageable. But the real test came when his teacher announced another exam. This time, Daniel didn't shrug it off. He didn't rely on last-minute studying. Instead, he prepared. The night before the test, he felt nervous but not afraid, because, for the first time, he knew he had done everything he could to succeed. When the test day arrived, he sat down, took a deep breath, and began writing. And this time, things were different. The questions didn't feel impossible. The answers didn't seem out of reach. He wasn't just guessing. He understood. A week later, the results were posted. As he walked up to the board, his heart pounded. But when he found his name, his eyes widened in disbelief. He had not only passed, he had scored one of the highest marks in the class. The room buzzed with whispers. His classmates, the same ones who had doubted him before, turned to him with surprise. And then, something unexpected happened. His teacher smiled and said to the class, "Today, I want to recognize a student who has shown incredible growth, someone who proved that intelligence alone isn't enough. It takes effort and perseverance to succeed. That student is Daniel." For a moment, there was silence. Then, applause filled the room. Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not in his natural ability, but in his hard work. He had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Success isn't given, it's earned. That day, as Daniel walked home, he felt different. Not because he had scored well on the test, but because he had proved something to himself. He had the power to change. No longer did he see failure as something to fear. Instead, he saw it as a stepping stone, a lesson that had made him stronger. His friends, who once doubted him, started noticing the change. One afternoon, as they were packing up after class, one of them approached him and said, "Daniel, you've really improved. Maybe we could study together sometime." Daniel smiled. A few months ago, those same friends had doubted his ability to help. Now, they saw him as someone to learn from, not because he was naturally smart, but because he had worked for it. But the biggest moment came later that evening. When he got home, he found his grandfather sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. Daniel sat beside him, holding his test paper. Without saying a word, he placed it in his grandfather's hands. The old man adjusted his glasses and looked at the score. Then, with a proud smile, he said, "So you finally met your greatest teacher." Daniel nodded. He understood now. "Yes, failure." His grandfather chuckled. "And what has it taught you?" Daniel thought for a moment, then said, "That success isn't about never failing, it's about never giving up." His grandfather patted his shoulder. "Then you're ready for whatever comes next." From that moment on, Daniel approached life differently. He no longer feared challenges, he embraced them. Years later, he carried that lesson with him as he faced new obstacles in college, in his career, and in his life. He eventually became a successful entrepreneur, but more importantly, he became someone who never backed down in the face of failure. And whenever he met someone struggling, unsure of themselves, he would share the same wisdom his grandfather had once given him. Failure is not your enemy, it is your teacher. Don't fear failure, learn from it. Success is earned through effort, not luck. Anyone can change if they are determined. Because in the end, the difference between those who succeed and those who don't isn't intelligence or talent. It's the willingness to learn, grow, and keep going. And Daniel had learned that lesson for life.